I want you to picture something. You're 79 years old, sitting across the breakfast table from the woman you married 53 years ago. And she looks up at you, mid-sentence, and asks you, gently, like she's asking a stranger for directions, what your name is again. Not angry, not frightened, just genuinely, quietly unsure. And you have to decide, in that half-second before you answer, whether to correct her or to simply tell her your name again, softly, the way you've told her 4 times already that same morning. My name is Harold Bennett. I'm 79 years old, and my wife, Eleanor, has Alzheimer's disease. We've been married 53 years. And a little over 2 years ago, we sold the house we'd lived in for 4 decades outside of Sacramento, California, and moved to a city called Iloilo in the Philippines. Most people, when I tell them that, assume I did it for the money, and I won't pretend the money isn't part of it. But that's not actually why we left. We left because a stranger in a grocery store in Sacramento looked at my wife with pity, and a stranger in a market in Iloilo looked at her with nothing but patience. And I decided, somewhere in the space between those 2 moments, that patience was worth crossing an ocean for. I need to back up, though, because none of this makes sense without the 53 years that came before it, and without understanding exactly what this disease actually does, slowly, to 2 people instead of 1. Eleanor and I met in 1971 at a community college night class, of all places, both of us there for entirely practical reasons that had nothing to do with romance. I was learning bookkeeping to move up at the auto parts distributor I worked for. She was finishing a teaching credential. We got married 2 years later, and she taught 3rd grade for 31 years at the same elementary school. The kind of teacher former students still recognized her by name decades later in the grocery store. I worked my way up over 4 decades to running the finance department for that same distributor. And between the 2 of us, we raised 1 daughter, Patricia, who's a nurse now up in Portland with 2 kids of her own. The first signs, looking back, were so small we didn't think anything of them at all. Eleanor misplacing her keys more than usual, repeating a story she'd told at dinner the week before, word for word, without any sense she'd told it already. I chalked it up to normal aging, the way you do, because the alternative wasn't something either of us wanted to consider. It was Patricia, actually, home for a visit about 4 years ago, who first said the word out loud. She'd noticed her mother struggling to follow a recipe she'd made 100 times, and she pulled me aside that evening and said, gently but directly, "Dad, I think we need to get Mom looked at." The diagnosis, when it finally came, was not a single dramatic moment, so much as a slow confirmation of something we'd both already half known and refused to name. Alzheimer's disease, early stage, the neurologist told us, sitting in a small office that smelled like hand sanitizer, using careful clinical language about progression and timelines that I mostly heard as a kind of distant roaring in my ears. Eleanor, to her enormous credit, took the news better than I did in that first appointment. She reached over and took my hand and said, "Well, Harold, I suppose we'd better make the most of the years I've still got all my wits about me." That's who my wife has always been, steadier than me in the moments that mattered most. I remember very little of the drive home from that appointment, except that Eleanor, at one point, reached over and turned up the radio, an old song from our courting days, and sang along to most of it, word for word, without a single hitch. I sat at that red light with tears I didn't let her see, thinking about how strange and cruel it was that a disease which would eventually take her memory of me entirely had for now left every lyric of a song from 1971 completely intact. I've come to understand over these past several years that this is simply how the disease moves, unevenly, sparing some rooms in the house while quietly emptying others. And there is no predicting on any given day which rooms will be which. The next 2 years in Sacramento were a slow education in a kind of exhaustion I hadn't known existed. Not physical exhaustion, though there was plenty of that too, but a specific, grinding kind that comes from watching the person you've built your entire adult life around slowly lose pieces of herself, one at a time, while the world around you keeps expecting you to function normally. I retired early to care for her full time, which strained our savings more than I let on to Patricia at the time. In-home care, when we could afford a few hours of it a week, ran close to $30 an hour. A single overnight stay at a proper memory care facility, when I looked into it purely to understand our options, started at nearly $9,000 a month. A number so far beyond what our retirement accounts could sustain for more than a couple of years that I closed the laptop that evening and didn't open it again for a month. I want to describe one particular week during that stretch, because I think it captures something the raw numbers don't. Eleanor had started wandering briefly in the early evenings, a common enough symptom, her doctor told us, but terrifying the first time it happens to you personally. She walked out our front door one Tuesday while I was in the shower, and I found her 4 houses down, standing on a neighbor's lawn, calmly examining their rose bushes, as though she'd simply stepped out for an ordinary evening walk, which, in her mind, she likely had. I installed door alarms after that, the kind that chime when a door opens, and for the following several months I slept, when I slept at all, with one ear listening for that chime, the way a new parent listens for a crying infant. I mention this not for sympathy, but because I think people who haven't lived inside this particular exhaustion don't fully understand how much of the burden isn't the big dramatic moments. It's the accumulated weight of 1,000 small vigilances stacked up night after night for years. Patricia offered, more than once, to have us move up near her in Portland, or to help find a facility closer to her that she could visit more easily. I appreciated the offer more than I said at the time, but the math there wasn't meaningfully better. And something in me resisted the idea of Eleanor's remaining independence being traded for proximity to family who, however loving, had their own full lives, jobs, grandchildren to attend to. I wanted, selfishly perhaps, to be the one caring for my wife myself, for as long as I possibly could, without a facility's schedule dictating our days. But the money, as hard as it was, wasn't actually the thing that broke something loose in me. It was smaller than that. It was a Tuesday afternoon at our regular grocery store, a place we'd shopped at for over 15 years, where Eleanor, mid-conversation with the cashier, a young woman who'd rung us up dozens of times before, suddenly lost the thread of what she was saying and stood there, keys in hand, looking lost in the middle of a sentence. The cashier was kind enough, but behind us in line, a woman maybe in her 50s sighed loudly, checked her watch, and said, just barely under her breath, but not quite quiet enough, "Some people should really have someone with them for this." Eleanor didn't fully register it, I did. I stood there holding a paper bag of groceries, 77 years old, feeling an anger I hadn't felt in decades. Not at the specific woman, really, but at the accumulated weight of 100 small moments like it. The sighs, the impatient glances, the way this disease seems to make some people treat my wife as an inconvenience, rather than a person who is still unmistakably present. That night, unable to sleep, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in years, which is simply searching the internet with no real plan, typing in questions I didn't expect real answers to. What does memory care cost in other countries? Is there anywhere an ordinary American retiree could actually afford real help? I don't fully know what led me specifically to the Philippines that first night, rather than anywhere else, except that an old army buddy of mine, a man named Walt Osgood, I'd served alongside decades earlier, had mentioned the last time we spoke on the phone, maybe 2 years prior, that he'd retired to a city there called Iloilo and seemed, from everything he said, remarkably content. I called Walt the next morning, my first honest conversation about any of it with anyone outside the family. He listened to the whole situation, the diagnosis, the costs, the grocery store. And then he told me something that stuck with me more than almost anything else anyone said during that whole period. Harold, the thing nobody tells you about this country is how differently people here think about taking care of family. It's not a burden here, the way it sometimes gets treated back home. It's just what you do. And that attitude extends further than you'd expect, even to strangers. I flew out alone about 6 weeks later, leaving Eleanor in Patricia's care. For what became the hardest 10 days I'd spent away from my wife in over 5 decades of marriage. Walt met me at the airport in Iloilo, and over the course of that visit, he showed me a city that surprised me in almost every particular. Smaller than Manila, calmer than what I'd braced for, with an old Spanish colonial heart to it, a long esplanade along the river that families walked every evening, and a genuine, functioning medical community, including, Walt was quick to point out, a teaching hospital with a proper neurology department, since the question of ongoing care for Eleanor was obviously the entire point of the trip. Walt's own house, where I stayed those 10 days, sat in a quiet neighborhood not far from the river, and on my second evening there, he introduced me to his neighbor across the street, an elderly woman named Nanay Cely, who, it turned out, had spent nearly a decade caring for her own husband through a long, difficult decline from a stroke before he passed. She sat with Walt and me on his porch that evening, and without my having asked for advice specifically, she offered it anyway, plainly, the way people there seem to do when they sense you're carrying something heavy. The hardest part is not the sickness, she told me, in careful, deliberate English. The hardest part is feeling alone while you carry it. Here, nobody should feel that alone. We don't allow it. I didn't fully believe her at the time, not entirely, having spent 2 years in Sacramento, discovering exactly how alone this particular kind of caregiving can make a person feel. But I filed the sentence away, the way you file away something you suspect might matter later. Walt introduced me to a woman named Corazon, a retired nurse in her 60s who, since her own retirement, had built up a modest home care practice, looking after a handful of elderly expats and locals alike. I sat with her for nearly 2 hours in a small coffee shop near the river, and I watched her talk through Eleanor's situation with a level of patience and genuine, unhurried attentiveness that I hadn't encountered from a single medical professional back in California in the past 2 years. She asked about Eleanor's favorite hobbies before the diagnosis, about what soothed her when she got anxious, about small specific details no insurance intake form back home had ever once asked me. She asked, too, about me, about how I was sleeping, whether I had anyone to talk to about the weight of it. A question that caught me so off guard I didn't have a ready answer. And she simply nodded, unsurprised, as though she'd expected exactly that response from an American husband 3 years into this particular exhaustion. When I finally asked her what her rates would be for daily in-home care, several hours a day, the number she gave me came to roughly a tenth of what the cheapest option in Sacramento had quoted. Before I flew home, Walt took me to the teaching hospital itself, mostly so I could see it with my own eyes rather than take his word for it. We didn't have an appointment, but a passing administrator, noticing us reading the directory in the lobby, stopped to ask if we needed help, and within 20 minutes had arranged for us to briefly meet one of the staff neurologists between her scheduled patients. A small courtesy that would have been unthinkable, I suspected, at most hospitals back home. That neurologist spoke with me for perhaps 15 unhurried minutes about the general standard of dementia care available there, unprompted and unbilled, simply because Walt had explained the situation and she'd had a gap in her afternoon. I flew home 4 days later with a folder of notes and a feeling I hadn't expected to have, something considerably lighter than the dread I'd carried onto that first flight. I flew home more conflicted than I'd expected to feel. Part of me knew, almost immediately, that this was the right decision. But another part of me sat with an enormous weight of guilt at the very idea of uprooting Eleanor at 77, moving her away from the only country, the only language, the only life she'd ever known, at the exact moment when her own grip on familiar things was already loosening. I talked it through extensively with Patricia, who, to her credit, asked hard, practical questions rather than simply objecting outright. "Dad, what happens if her condition gets significantly worse and you need a higher level of care than what's available there?" I told her honestly that I didn't have a perfect answer, only that Corazon had connected me with the neurology department at that teaching hospital, and that the trajectory of Eleanor's particular case, discussed at length with her existing doctor back home, suggested we likely had a reasonable window of time before that became an urgent concern. What ultimately decided it for me wasn't the money, though the money mattered enormously. It was a conversation with Eleanor herself, on one of her clearer days, sitting in our kitchen in Sacramento. I explained the whole idea to her as plainly as I could, the cost, the care, the move. She listened, and then she reached over, the way she had in that neurologist's office years earlier, and took my hand. "Harold, I don't remember what I had for breakfast some days anymore, but I remember you. And if moving somewhere means you're not so tired and worried all the time, then I think we should go. I don't know that I've ever loved my wife more than in that particular moment, 51 years into our marriage, her memory failing her in 100 small ways, and still somehow landing on exactly the right thing to say." We moved 8 months later, after selling the house, after Patricia flew down twice to help us sort through 4 decades of belongings, after more paperwork than I care to fully recount, involving Eleanor's diagnosis and the medical documentation required for both our long-stay visas. The visa process itself took considerably longer than either of us anticipated, partly because Eleanor's condition required additional medical clearance documentation that our immigration lawyer, a patient man named Attorney Reyes, who specialized in exactly this kind of case, walked us through step by step over several months of calls and paperwork. He was upfront that the process would be slower and more careful given Eleanor's diagnosis, and I appreciated that honesty more than I can say, since it meant no unpleasant surprises once we'd already committed to the move. People often ask me for the actual numbers, so let me give them plainly, because I think the specifics matter more than vague reassurances. Our house here, a modest 3-bedroom with the covered porch and small garden, runs us 22,000 pesos a month in rent, somewhere around $390. Corazon's care, 6 mornings a week, several hours each visit, comes to roughly 18,000 pesos monthly, just over $300. A fraction of even the cheapest partial home care option we'd priced out in Sacramento. Add utilities, groceries, Eleanor's medications, which cost noticeably less here, even accounting for the ones we still have shipped from the States, and our full monthly expenses land somewhere around 80,000 pesos, just over $1,400. My pension and Social Security together cover that with real room to spare. Room that simply did not exist in our old life, where the in-home care alone, on the rare weeks we could afford more than a few hours of it, ran close to what our entire monthly budget covers here. Corazon met us at the airport in Iloilo with a wheelchair for Eleanor, since the long flight had exhausted her considerably, and a small bouquet of flowers that she pressed into Eleanor's hands the moment she saw her, saying simply, "Welcome home, Ma'am Eleanor," as though she'd known her for years rather than minutes. The house we'd arranged, sight unseen except through photographs, was a modest, single-story place in a quiet residential area not far from the river, with a small covered porch and a low fence separating us from a next-door neighbor, an older woman named Fely, who, within our first week there, had already introduced herself, brought over a plate of something called biko, a sweet, sticky rice dish, and asked, gently, and without any trace of pity in her voice, how she could help. That distinction, the complete absence of pity in the way people there approached Eleanor's condition, is something I've thought about more than almost anything else in these past 2 years. Corazon came 6 days a week, mornings mostly, and the routine she built with Eleanor over those early months was unlike anything either of us had experienced with paid caregivers back home. She didn't simply supervise Eleanor or manage her medications, though she did that too, thoroughly. She engaged with her, sang old American songs from the radio era that Eleanor still, remarkably, remembered every word to, walked her slowly through the small garden behind the house, identifying flowers, patient through every repetition, every lost thread of conversation, every moment Eleanor forgot she'd already asked the same question 5 minutes earlier. I remember standing in the kitchen doorway one morning, maybe 6 weeks in, watching Corazon and Eleanor laugh together over something I hadn't caught, and feeling a specific kind of relief I hadn't experienced since before the diagnosis. The relief of watching someone else treat my wife like a whole person, not a diagnosis. I settled, over those first several months, into a rhythm of my own, alongside Corazon's care schedule. Most mornings, once Corazon arrived, I'd walk the short distance to a small bakery near the corner, run by a wiry, energetic man named Boy, who, within our second week, had already learned my order and my habit of buying an extra piece of pan de sal for Eleanor, even on the mornings she wouldn't remember eating it later. Boy asked about Eleanor by name every single time, not out of obligation, it seemed, but genuine, ongoing curiosity. And when I mentioned once, in passing, that she'd had a difficult night, he pressed an extra pastry into my hands the next morning. "For the both of you, no charge," waving off my attempt to pay for it. In the afternoons, while Eleanor napped, I found myself, somewhat to my own surprise, joining a small group of retired men, mostly local, a few fellow expats, including Walt, who gathered most days at a covered basketball court a few blocks from our house, not to play at our age, but to sit on the sidelines and watch the younger men run games while we talked. It became, in its own quiet way, the first genuinely social outlet I'd had in years, since so much of my life back in Sacramento had narrowed, almost without my noticing, down to Eleanor and the four walls of our house. Walt, who'd been through his own long goodbye with his first wife before she passed, understood something about my particular exhaustion that even Patricia, for all her love and clinical training, couldn't fully access from the outside. It was Walt, in fact, who eventually introduced me to a small, informal gathering of other expat spouses, caring for partners with various forms of dementia. A loose group of maybe 6 of us, who met every couple of weeks at a coffee shop near the river to simply talk, without judgment, about the specific, unglamorous mechanics of what we were all carrying. A retired Australian named Reg, whose wife had progressed considerably further than Eleanor, taught me more in one afternoon about managing sundowning, the anxious agitation that often sets in for dementia patients in the late afternoon, than any pamphlet I'd been handed back in Sacramento. A woman named Susan, caring for her husband, cried openly during our second meeting about the particular grief of loving someone who sometimes no longer recognized you as their spouse. And nobody in that group so much as blinked, because every single one of us understood exactly what she meant without needing it explained further. I hadn't realized until that first meeting how starved I'd been for exactly that kind of company. People who didn't need the disease explained to them, who simply already knew. The neurology team at the teaching hospital, when we finally had our first full consultation, about 10 weeks after arriving, spent nearly 90 minutes with us, reviewing Eleanor's full history, running a fresh set of cognitive assessments, adjusting her medication slightly based on how she'd been responding. The lead neurologist, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Villanueva, who'd trained partly in Australia before returning home to practice, explained everything patiently, in plain language, answering every one of my increasingly detailed questions without once making me feel like I was taking up too much of her time. At one point, Eleanor, midway through a cognitive assessment question about the current date, grew visibly frustrated with herself, and Dr. Villanueva simply set down her clipboard entirely, took Eleanor's hand across the desk, and said gently, "It's all right, Mrs. Bennett. This isn't a test you can fail. We're just getting to know how your mind likes to work these days." Eleanor visibly relaxed, and the rest of the assessment went considerably more smoothly. I don't believe, in 3 years of appointments back in Sacramento, a single specialist had ever once set down their clipboard for my wife's sake. That full consultation, medication adjustment included, came to a little under 4,000 pesos, around $70. I sat in the car afterward, doing the kind of disbelieving math I imagine most Americans do at some point after moving here, thinking about what an equivalent specialist consultation at that length, with that level of attention, would have cost back in Sacramento, assuming I could have even gotten an appointment that thorough at all. I want to be honest about the parts of this that remain hard, because I think it does a disservice to anyone watching this who might be in a similar situation to pretend that moving somewhere new erases the disease itself. It doesn't. Eleanor has good days and difficult days here, exactly the way she did in California. There are mornings she wakes disoriented, unsure for a few frightening minutes where she is, or why the ceiling above her looks unfamiliar. There are afternoons she grows anxious and repetitive in a way that tests every ounce of patience I have left in me. And there are moments, still, when she looks at me with an expression that tells me she's searching for my name and coming up empty, and I have to decide, in that half-second, whether to correct her gently or simply answer as though she'd asked me something entirely ordinary. What has changed, what moving here actually gave us, isn't a cure, or even meaningfully slower progression. Though her doctors here believe the calmer daily rhythm and consistent patient care have genuinely helped stabilize her in ways that might not have held in the more frantic pace of our old life. What changed is the texture of the disease itself, the way it's carried by both of us and by the people around us. Fely, next door, still comes by most weeks, and on Eleanor's harder days, she doesn't flinch or grow impatient the way that stranger in the Sacramento grocery store once did. She simply adjusts, slows down, meets Eleanor exactly where she is that day. I've watched jeepney drivers wait a full extra minute without a trace of irritation, while Eleanor worked out, slowly, which coins to hand over. I've watched a young waitress at a small restaurant we frequent near the river patiently repeat the day's specials 3 times without any change in her tone, the same warm patience on the third telling as the first. About a year into our time here, Eleanor had a difficult stretch, several weeks where her anxiety spiked considerably. Made worse, Dr. Villanueva suspected, by a minor infection that had gone briefly undiagnosed and was clearly disorienting her further. I brought her in for an emergency evaluation on a Sunday, worried in a way I hadn't been since the initial diagnosis, and the hospital staff, despite it being an off day with a skeleton crew on duty, took us seriously immediately, ran the necessary tests, identified the infection, and had her on the right course of treatment within hours. Corazon, when I called her that evening, simply to let her know what had happened, insisted on coming by the very next morning, despite it being her day off. "Just to see Ma'am Eleanor's face and know for myself she's all right," she said. And I don't believe, in 2 years back in Sacramento, a single paid caregiver had ever once made a gesture like that, outside of scheduled hours. That same year, our neighborhood held its annual fiesta. A tradition I'd read about but hadn't fully understood until I lived through one myself. Every house on our street, ours included, was expected to open its door to anyone who walked in. And Fely, seeing that I had no idea how to prepare, simply took over our kitchen the day before, cooking alongside 2 of her sisters, insisting it was no trouble at all. Eleanor, on a relatively clear day that fell, fortunately, right in the middle of it, sat on our porch greeting a steady stream of neighbors, most of whom she didn't fully recognize, with the same warm, teacherly hospitality she'd shown 3 decades of third-graders back in Sacramento. She didn't remember most of their names an hour later. But in the moment, surrounded by people who clearly adored her without needing her to remember them in return, she looked, for one whole afternoon, entirely and simply happy. I stood in the doorway watching it, the way I so often find myself watching her these days, and thought that if I'd stayed in Sacramento, this particular kind of afternoon, this specific, uncomplicated joy, would likely never have found her at all. Patricia came to visit about 14 months in. Her first time seeing the life we'd actually built, rather than hearing about it secondhand over increasingly reassuring phone calls. She landed braced, I think, for something considerably more precarious than what she found. I introduced her to Corazon, to Fely, to Dr. Villanueva, and I watched my daughter, a nurse herself, with 2 decades of clinical experience, quietly assess every aspect of her mother's care with a professional's scrutiny. She sat in on one of Corazon's morning sessions entirely, watching, asking careful questions afterward about medication timing and behavioral triggers. And I could see, gradually over that first day, the tightly wound clinical vigilance in her shoulders start to ease, just slightly. On her second evening, we took her to the small restaurant near the river Eleanor and I had come to think of as our regular spot, and Patricia watched the young waitress there, a woman named Girlie, who'd served us dozens of times by then, repeat the day's specials patiently for her mother, twice, without a single flicker of impatience crossing her face. Afterward, walking back along the esplanade in the evening heat, Patricia said quietly, "Back home, I've watched aides get frustrated with patients for exactly that, Dad. Having to repeat something twice. I've seen it happen." "I know," I told her. "I used to brace for it every single time we went anywhere back in Sacramento. I don't brace for it here anymore." She was quiet for a long moment after that. On her third day, sitting on our small covered porch, watching Corazon walk her mother slowly through the garden, identifying flowers Eleanor had already forgotten the names of, twice that same afternoon, and would forget again in another few minutes. Unhurried through every single repetition, Patricia turned to me with tears in her eyes and said, "Dad, I don't think Mom's ever been looked after this gently, not even by me." I told her I understood exactly what she meant, because I'd had roughly the same thought, watching from that kitchen doorway, more times than I could count. Before she left, Patricia asked me the question I imagined she'd been building up to the whole visit. Whether I had any regrets about the move, about taking her mother so far from the country and the life she'd spent 77 years building. I told her the truth, which is that I regret deeply that this disease exists at all, that I regret every single thing it has taken from Eleanor and, by extension, from all of us. But I do not regret, for even a single day, the decision to bring her somewhere that treats what remains of her with patience instead of pity. "That's not nothing, Dad," Patricia said. "That might actually be everything, given what you're both dealing with." I think of everything anyone has said to me in the past 2 years, that's the sentence I've held on to the tightest. Eleanor is 81 now. Some days she knows exactly who I am, tells me stories from our early marriage with a clarity that catches in my throat every single time. Other days she asks my name gently, like a stranger asking for directions, and I tell her, softly, the way I've told her countless times before, and we go on with our morning. I've stopped needing that to feel like a small tragedy every single time it happens. Because here, in this particular corner of the world, nobody around us treats it as one either. Corazon still comes 6 mornings a week. Fely still brings biko on the difficult afternoons. The jeepney drivers still wait that extra minute without complaint. Boy at the bakery still asks after Eleanor by name every single morning, and still, more often than not, presses an extra pastry into my hands for her. I think often about that woman in the Sacramento grocery store. The sigh, the checked watch, the muttered comment. I don't carry anger toward her anymore. Not really. I've come to think she likely knew nothing about this disease, had never watched anyone she loved slip slowly away from language and memory while their body stayed stubbornly, achingly present. I think in a country that talks endlessly about efficiency and independence and moving quickly through the world, it's easy to grow impatient with anything that asks you to slow down. What I found here instead is a place that seems to understand, almost instinctively, that some things simply cannot and should not be rushed, and that a person's worth was never actually tied to how quickly they could finish a sentence or count out their change. Walt still comes by most weeks, and Nanay Cely from across the street in his neighborhood, now something of a friend to us both, still occasionally repeats that sentence she offered me on my very first visit, usually right when I need to hear it most. The hardest part is not the sickness. The hardest part is feeling alone while you carry it. I understand now, in a way I couldn't have when she first said it, exactly what she meant, because I have felt every single day for the past 2 years the difference between carrying this alone and carrying it surrounded by people who simply refuse to let me. I'm 79 years old, caring for my wife for 53 years through a disease that has no cure and eventually no good ending. And if there's one thing I've learned in these past 2 years, it's that where you carry a hard thing matters almost as much as the thing itself. We couldn't change what was happening to Eleanor's mind, but we could change the world she was navigating it inside of. And it turns out that world here is simply gentler than the one we left behind. If this story meant something to you, I'd be grateful if you'd like the video and subscribe. There are more stories like ours, and I think you'll find them worth the time. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. I'll see you in the next.